there is a particular possible catalyst in this time we live in, which is for really kind of raising the question of gain of function research for the application of virus, making viruses more dangerous, is the question of whether COVID leaked from a lab. They're sort of not even answering that question, but even asking that question is it seems like a very important question to ask to catalyze the conversation about whether we should be doing gain of function research. I mean, from a high level, why do you think people, even colleagues of mine, are not comfortable asking that question? And two, do you think that the answer could be that it did leak from a lab?
I think the mere possibility that it did leak from a lab is evidence enough, again, for the hypothetical, rational national leaders watching this simple PowerPoint. If you could put the possibility at 1%, and you look at the unbelievable destructive power that COVID had, that should be an overwhelmingly powerful argument for excluding it. Now, as to whether or not that was a leak, some very, very level. I don't know enough about all of the factors in the Bayesian analysis and so forth that has gone into people making the pro argument of that. So I don't pretend to be an expert on that, and I don't have a point of view. I just don't know. But what we can say is it is entirely possible for a couple of reasons. One is that there is a BSL-4 lab in Wuhan, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I believe it's the only BSL-4 in China. I could be wrong about that. But it definitely had a history that alarmed very sophisticated U.S. diplomats and others who were in contact with the lab and were aware of what it was doing long before COVID hit the world. And so there are diplomatic cables that have been declassified. I believe one sophisticated scientist or other observer said that WIV is a ticking time bomb. And I believe it's also been pretty reasonably established that coronaviruses were a topic of great interest at WIV. SARS obviously came out of China, and that's a coronavirus, so it would make an enormous amount of sense for it to be studied there. And there is so much opacity about what happened in the early days and weeks after the outbreak that's basically been imposed by the Chinese government that we just don't know. So it feels like a substantially or greater than 1% possibility to me, looking at it from the outside. And that's something that one could imagine. Now we're going to the realm of thought experiment, not me decreeing this is what happened, but if they're studying coronavirus at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and there is this precedent of gain of function research that's been done on something that is remarkably uncontagious to humans, whereas we know coronavirus is contagious to humans. I could definitely, and there is this global consensus, certainly was the case, 2 or 3 years ago when this work might have started, seems to be this global consensus that gain of function is fine. The U.S. paused funding for a little while, but paused funding. They never said private actors couldn't do it. Mm-hmm. It was just a pause of NIH funding. And then that pause was lifted. So again, none of this is irrational. You could certainly see the folks at WIV saying, gain of function, interesting vector, coronavirus, unlike H5N1, very contagious. We're in a nation that has had terrible run-ins with coronavirus. Why don't we do a little gain of function on this? And then, like all labs at all levels, one can imagine this lab leaking. So it's not an impossibility, and very, very level-headed people have said that, who have looked at it much more deeply, do believe in that outcome.
Why is it such a threat to power, the idea that it'll leak from a lab? Why is it so threatening? I don't maybe understand this point exactly. Like, is it just that as governments, and especially the Chinese government, is really afraid of admitting mistakes that everybody makes? So this is a horrible mistake. Chernobyl is a good example. I come from the Soviet Union. I mean, major mistakes were made in Chernobyl. I would argue for a lab leak to happen, the scale of the mistake is much smaller, right? The depth and the breadth of rot that in bureaucracy that led to Chernobyl is much bigger than anything that could lead to a lab leak. Because it could literally just be, I mean, I'm sure there's very careful security procedures, even in level 3 labs, but it, I imagine, maybe you can correct me, it's all it takes is the incompetence of a small number of individuals,
or even
on
one. Yeah.
one individual on a particular, a couple weeks, 3 weeks period, as opposed to a multi-year bureaucratic failure of the entire government.
Right. Well, certainly the magnitude of mistakes and compounding mistakes that went in Chernobyl was far, far, far greater.
Yeah.
But the consequence of COVID outweighs the consequence of Chernobyl to a tremendous degree. And, I think that particularly authoritarian governments are unbelievably reluctant to admit to any fallibility whatsoever. And there's a long, long history of that across dozens and dozens of authoritarian governments. And to be transparent, again, this is in the hypothetical world in which this was a leak, which again, I don't personally have enough sophistication to have an opinion on the likelihood. But in the hypothetical world in which it was a leak, the global reaction and the amount of global animus and the amount of, the decline in global respect that would happen toward China, because every country suffered massively from this, unbelievable damages in terms of human lives and economic activity disrupted. The world would in some way present China with that bill. And when you take on top of that the natural disinclination for any authoritarian government to admit any fallibility and tolerate the possibility of any fallibility whatsoever, and you look at the relative opacity, even though they let a World Health Organization group in, a couple of months ago to run around, they didn't give that WHO group anywhere near the level of access that would be necessary to definitively say X happened versus Y. The level of opacity that surrounds those opening weeks and months of COVID in China, we just don't know.